Ahi ahi pai, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to today's seminar in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today we're hearing from Dr. Linda Fatialofa, and I'm really excited to hear her talk. It's on a topic that's close to my heart. So Linda is a Samoan researcher, an intern psychologist, and an incoming lecturer in forensic psychology at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. And her work spans forensic psychology, clinical psychology, and Pacific public health, with a focus on mental well-being, youth justice, and developing theory from the perspectives and experiences of the people who have historically been underrepresented in psychological and criminological scholarship. And today, Linda is here to talk to us about her really impressive PhD research.
Thank you, Aotearoa, for that warm welcome. Talofa lava and warm Pacific greetings. My name is Linda Fatialofa. As Aotearoa mentioned, I'm currently an intern psychologist based in Wanganui Hospital. And last year I completed my PhD in forensic psychology. And so my research explored the lived experiences of justice-involved youth in Aotearoa to better understand the pathways to offending and how those experiences can inform theory development, which is what I'll be sharing with you all today. So just to kick us off, I wanted to open with a proverb. E lea tū whaamanga se tangata. No one stands alone like a mountain. And so this Samoan proverb reminds us that people can't be separated from the context in which they live. Our experiences, opportunities, and choices are all shaped by the social, cultural, historical, and environmental worlds around us. So that idea really is at the heart of the research that I'll be sharing. Now this slide is really just a snapshot of the people, places, and culture that have shaped who I am. As a first-generation New Zealand-born Samoan, I was raised in Porirua while staying closely connected to Samoa. And so growing up between these two worlds taught me that people's behaviours rarely make sense when viewed in isolation. And that understanding shaped the questions I brought into my research. So rather than just asking why young people offend, I wanted to understand how they made sense of their journeys. Unsurprisingly, what emerged was that their stories were rarely about offending. They were stories of identity, family, belonging, adversity, opportunity, and the systems that shape their lives. So in many ways, their stories really brought this proverb to life. So before I get into the substance of my talk, I'll start with a quick overview of where we're heading today. So first I'll begin with some scene setting, looking at the developmental context and some key risk factors for youth offending. From there, I'll introduce the meta-theoretical framework, which I use to situate my research and talk about what that revealed in terms of gaps in existing theory base. I'll then take you through my study and introduce the descriptive model before closing with some key implications and reflections on practice. So just to take a step back, I want to start by briefly looking at the developmental context. So adolescence is a period of really significant change across multiple domains. And so for anyone who's lived with a teenager or remembers being one, you'll know it's rarely the calmest stage of life. Biologically and physically, young people are going through puberty and all the hormonal changes that come with it, influencing things like mood, emotions, energy, and risk-taking. Psychosocially, there's also a growing drive for independence and autonomy. Young people naturally begin spending more time with peers and less with parents and families. Relationships outside the home become increasingly important, and they're also trying to work out who they are, what matters to them, and where they fit in. At the same time, from a neurodevelopmental perspective, the brain is still maturing. in particular the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for things like planning, impulse control, and decision making, are still developing well into early adulthood. Before we get into the theory side of things, it's useful to start with one of the most well-established findings in criminology. So many of you will probably be familiar with the age crime curve. And so what this shows is that offending increases during adolescence, peaks in the mid to late teenage years, and then declines sharply as young people move into adulthood. And so, although this graph uses data from the US, the same pattern has been replicated across countries and time periods, making it one of the most robust findings in criminology. What's important isn't just the pattern itself, but what it prompted researchers to ask. That is, why does offending increase during adolescence? Why do most young people stop offending as they get older? And why does a much smaller group continue offending into adulthood? And so those questions have really shaped decades of youth offending research. But it's worth kind of considering what youth offending looks like here in Aotearoa. So looking specifically at Aotearoa, one of the most consistent patterns is the disproportionate representation of Māori and Pacific young people in the justice system. Although Māori make up around 18% of the population and Pacific 9%, together they account for the majority of young people involved in youth justice. Importantly, this pattern isn't unique to Aotearoa, because it's also seen in other countries with Indigenous and minority populations. And so we know that around 4 out of young people that are charged by the courts are male, and that most common offences are theft, burglary, and assault. So contrary to how youth offending is sometimes portrayed, the data supports that most offending involves property and lower level interpersonal offences rather than your more serious violent crimes. And that distinction really matters because media and political narratives can sometimes present youth offending as a single uniform problem, leading to responses to swing between rehabilitation and punitive approaches. And so while these data tells us who's most affected and the nature of youth offending in Aotearoa, they tell us much less about the factors that contribute to offending. So much of the youth offending literature has focused on identifying the factors associated with offending. And these broadly fall into kind of 3 main areas. The first relates to the young person themselves. So individual characteristics, including factors such as mental health difficulties, impulsivity, IQ, and substance use. The second concerns the environments they're growing in, including family stress, exposure to violence, and instability at home. And the third centres on their social work, including school difficulties, peer influences, and the presence or absence of positive support networks. And so together these factors have provided a really important foundation for understanding youth offending. The next question, though, is how theories bring these influences together into coherent explanations. So to explore that, I turn to Ward and Hudson's meta-theoretical framework, which organises theories according to what they're trying to explain and where the gaps might be in those explanations. So they propose that theories can be organised according to their level of explanation. So from broad accounts of offending through to really detailed explanations of how offending can unfold. I'm going to use a Samoan whale or a house just as a visual metaphor to kind of step us through this framework. But the idea is that the same whale or house looks different depending on where you're viewing it from, either from a mountain, a coconut tree, or sitting in a canoe. In the same way, each level of theory offers a different lens for understanding youth offending. The broadest are multi-factor theories. Like viewing the whale from the mountaintop, you see the wider landscape, but little detail of the whale itself. These theories bring together multiple influences on offending. And one of the kind of classic theoretical examples is Moffat's developmental taxonomy theory as a type of theory that you'd classify as a multi-factor theory. Next are single factor theories. Like the view from a coconut tree, here you're closer and you can focus on one feature. These theories tend to examine single processes, such as social control or peer influence in relation to youth offending. Finally, there are micro-level theories, which I compare to the view from a canoe. From here, you can see inside the whale and understand what's happening from the perspective of those within it. These theories focus on how offending unfolds through young people's lived experiences. And so applying this framework to youth offending, to me, really highlighted a gap. While existing theories explain broad developmental patterns and risk factors well, much less attention had been given to people's lived experiences, and that became the focus of my research. So the central aim of my study was to develop a descriptive micro-level theory that was grounded in young people's own perspectives. To anchor this, I focused on three key questions. The first explored the context that young people were embedded within, the systems, relationships, and environments that shaped their lives and experiences. The second focused on the offence process. So what was happening at the time for them? What were they thinking? What triggered or activated their actions? And what were they trying to achieve through the offence? The third focused on their reflections after an offence. So how did young people look back on what happened? What did they understand differently? And what did they see as being important for change? So to do this, the study involved 20 males aged between 14 to 18 years old. So all of them had been arrested by police and had already received a youth justice outcome. Of the 20 participants, approximately 85% identified as Māori, 35% as Pacific, 10% as Pākehā, and 10% as other. So data collection took place over a 4-year period through one-on-one semi-structured interviews lasting about 50 minutes on average. I travelled urban and rural areas across the North Island. So for the 4 years, I lived here, there and everywhere. But in the end, I worked closely with 7 community organisations and groups for recruitment. So I used a qualitative approach that was informed by grounded theory. So rather than starting with an existing theory or a pre-existing theory, I started with young people's experiences. Beginning with the raw interview data, I looked for patterns and recurring ideas, which were then grouped into broader categories. Then these categories were then refined and connected together, which then laid the groundwork for the next stage, which was linking these categories together to develop the model. Now, after developing the early categories, I began mapping out how they fit together. I first organised categories based on how close they were in the time to the offence. Some categories reflected influences that had been present in young people's lives for a long time, such as family experiences, the broader life circumstances. Others captured factors that occurred closer to the offence itself. including events or situations that help kind of set things in motion. Finally, some categories focused on what happened after the offence. So this included things like how young people understood, explained, and responded to their behaviour. So once these categories had been organised and connected, they formed three interconnected models: the contextual model, the offence process model, and the offence evaluation model. And so together these models capture how young people describe their pathway into offending, their experiences during their offending, and how they made sense of those experiences after. So what I'd like to do now is kind of take you through each model in turn and highlight just a key insight that emerged from each, because there's quite a bit to go through. So I'll begin with the contextual model, which focuses on broader environments, systems, and experiences that shape young people's lives long before the offence itself occurred. So as I mentioned, one of the strongest findings within the contextual model was the way culture operated as an interwoven influence throughout young people's lives. Rather than existing as a standalone factor, culture really shaped how participants understood themselves, their relationships, and their place within wider systems. So for many young people, this was expressed through experiences of racism, stereotyping, and discrimination. So as John describes, simply walking into a shop could result in assumptions being made about who he was and what he might do. What stood out to me wasn't just the experience itself, but the way repeated exposure to these messages appeared to shape how some young people saw themselves and how they responded to the world around them. For some, there was a sense of being treated as a problem well before they had even done anything wrong. Culture also emerged through experiences of intergenerational disconnection. So Dallin's account highlights how experiences of racism within previous generations had ripple effects across families, contributing to separation from culture, identity, and community. And so these narratives weren't simply about individual experiences of disconnection, but reflected how historical experiences can continue to influence belonging and cultural connection across generations. Finally, participants also spoke about broader kind of social and structural inequities. So Chris reflects on seeing Māori communities experience disadvantage while feeling overlooked by institutions and systems that were intended to support them. These experiences contributed to a sense of exclusion and mistrust, and really shaped how some young people understood fairness, opportunity, and also their place within society. So taken together, these accounts suggest that culture isn't simply an individual characteristic, rather it reflects a complex interplay of cultural identity, intergenerational experiences, systemic influences, belonging, exclusion, and the broader social conditions in which young people are developing within. And so this is why I opted for the construct of culture to really sit around the entire contextual model, because it continuously shaped and influenced wider systems that young people were navigating. So just moving on to the offence process model, one of the most salient findings here was the central role of social groups. So almost every young person offended alongside peers, highlighting how belonging and social validation were really key influences during this phase. Often groups provided a sense of safety and loyalty, but also influenced how offences were carried out. Being part of a group gave young people a sense of status and recognition that was often missing elsewhere in their lives. Finally, The evaluation model focused on how young people are made sense of and reflected on their offending. Many described being in an ongoing process of self-discovery. A few recognised that their identity wasn't fixed by their past actions but could continue to evolve, while others, however, found it really difficult to separate who they were from what they had done. And to me, this phase really revealed how identity was actively reshaped and negotiated in the aftermath of an offence. So, just in bringing all of this together, what the descriptive model does is bring together the three models I've just discussed into a more single kind of framework. Each model captures a different part of a young person's journey, but they're all connected. So on the left, you'll see the contextual pathway model captures the broader experiences and circumstances young people bring with them. These experiences shape their goals, how they understand the world, and how they function psychologically. Moving on to the centre with the purple boxes, the offence process model focused on how these factors interact with social groups and environments to create pathways towards offending. The arrows here show that these influences are connected and build on one another rather than operating independently. And so the offence itself sits at the centre of the model. But importantly, it's not the end point. On the right, the post-offence evaluation model captures what happened afterwards. Young people reflected on their actions, made sense of what had happened, and incorporated those experiences into how they saw themselves and their futures. The arrows show that each part of the process influences the next. So while the loop at the bottom highlights that this isn't a one-off or linear process, how young people make sense of an offence can shape their future thinking, behaviour, relationships and experiences, which then become part of the key context they carry forward. And so in that sense, the process is ongoing and continuously evolving. So what I hope this research demonstrates is how theory and lived experience can really inform one another. The aim was really to better understand youth offending from young people's perspectives and use those insights to extend theory in this area. As an intern psychologist, I've come to appreciate the importance of formulation. To me, this model offers a large-scale formulation of youth offending, bringing together experiences, social context, psychological processes, and post-offence interpretations into a more cohesive understanding. So just to finish where I began, ele tū whaamaunga se tangata. No one stands alone like a mountain. No one succeeds alone. And as the late whaanana Vessel Collins wisely added, no one should suffer alone. The stories shared by these young people remind us that offending doesn't occur in isolation. It emerges within families, communities, relationships, cultures, and wider systems. If we want to understand offending, we must first understand the context in which young people's lives unfold. So just before I open up for questions, I just want to also mention that there are so many people that I owe this journey to. In particular, I want to acknowledge the 20 young people who so generously shared their time, their stories, and their truths with me. The aim of co-creating this research wasn't simply to do research about young people, but to make a contribution with them. Their voices are a gift to future research and practice, and a reminder that we need to listen before we seek to understand. So on that note, whaafitai te lelawa for listening.